Dewey Cornell really set the table for me quite well, noting that mostly we are safe in our schools. We need to make everyone safe in all places. And most of the data I have, actually all the data I have, will not be specific to schools, but I think the concepts are transferable within school or externally. First slide, please. I first just want to point out through this slide how abnormal we are when you compare the United States to other high-income Western democracies. This is simply plotting the ratio of our homicide rates involving young people versus that of the average, weighted average of all these other nations. The yellow bar is our overall homicide rate, which in the 5 to 14 group is a little more than four times higher than the average of these other high-income countries. In the 15 to 24 age group, it's 14 times higher, 14 times higher. The next two bars, the red bar being the firearm homicide rate with guns, and the gray bar being with all other means. You can see from this slide what the issue is. Our rates for homicides involving 5 to 14 year olds with firearms nearly 20 times higher and nearly 50 times higher for ages 15 to 24. We do not have unusually high rates of mental illness in our population among our young. We don't have unusually high rates of bullying. What we have is unusually high rates of ready access to lethal weaponry. Next slide, please. That's also evidence in this next very simple slide. 88%, if you look at victims of gun homicides of high school age, 14 to 18, 88% die with firearms. Next slide, please. There's a real racial imbalance in what this looks like as well. Over 9 times the rate of firearm homicide among blacks versus whites, whereas for suicides, whites in this age group of 14 to 18, white rate of homicide is twice that of blacks. Next slide, please. So I'm going to briefly go through sort of 4 main issues as it connects to gun policy. 1 has to do with our standards for legal gun ownership. 2 has to do with mechanisms to address, to keep prohibited people from having guns. The 3rd has to do with concealed carry and public carrying of guns. And finally, has to do with design of guns, and principally with respect to assault weapons. Next slide, please. Well, let's start with this basic fact. Now, I don't think most can actually see well enough the x-axis, but I'll tell you what this looks like. This is our age-specific homicide offending rates, and you see how dramatically that they escalate during the adolescent years. The years that they peak are between the years of 18 and 20 years old. And they really don't dramatically decline until mid-20s. So this is obviously a very relevant age as it relates to when the young man who committed the horrendous act of violence in Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School acquired his firearms and carried out the act. Next slide, please. 60% were legal to possess the gun when they committed that act of violence. So much of our conversation about gun policy bifurcates one group as everybody's law-abiding because they're legal to have a firearm, and another group that is some hardened criminals. Well, if you look in the states with our weakest gun laws, that's not what it looks like with respect to who commits acts of violence. And I'll explain more about that in just a minute. But I also want to compare this with all the other states. In all the other states, 1/3 of the individuals who commit acts of violence with guns and who are imprisoned were legal to possess their guns. So there's a real difference across our states between, depending on where they set their standards for people being able to legally possess guns. Next. This illustrates basically what that difference between the weak law states and the strong law states. What explains that difference? Principally, it has to do with prohibitions, and these are temporary prohibitions for young people, either in this 18 to 20 age group, or, individuals who committed serious crimes that were adjudicated in the juvenile system. So all the things that we identified that most explain this were things that in these stronger standard states are temporary prohibitions. They're not lifelong prohibitions, and that is because the risk is not static over time, okay? That's a really important concept that applies both to safety and to fairness with respect to how we're going to establish our effective gun laws. Next, please. Now, whenever there's a mass shooting, the conversation is, well, this is all about mental illness. Well, in mass shootings, you have a higher rate of people going through very specific mental illness episodes. But if you look at our problem largely of violence in the United States, the best epidemiologic evidence suggests that you can explain about 4% of our violence problem due to mental illness. So if someone brilliant enough could come up with some vaccine to completely eliminate all mental illness within our entire country, we would have a whopping 4% reduction in our violence rate. So while mental illness is a very important thing that is an important part of public health, as has been discussed, it is not going to address our gun violence problem, only a small portion as it relates to interpersonal violence. Suicide is a completely different matter. Very important with respect to suicide. Next slide, please. So in the months soon after Sandy Hook, some academic experts and other groups actually met at Johns Hopkins to sort of sort through the very difficult issues, both on the science and legal aspects of what you do about this issue with mental illness and guns. And I have to say, I was a little bit skeptical that anything useful was going to come from this. But what actually emerged is one of the most powerful things that I think I've seen in gun policy in my 25 years in it, the formation of something called the Consortium for Risk-Based Firearm Policy. When we actually looked at the data and said, how can we have the biggest impact on violent crime with guns, we said, well, mental illness is not going to take us very far on this. What's the best predictor of violence is prior violence. So the group came up with very specific recommendations. Some of it are now really being a bright light is shined upon them, in part because of Parkland, sadly, of extreme risk protection orders. That was one of the recommendations that came from that, that really recognizes that risk and crises emerge very rapidly, and our prohibitions or our conditions for keeping guns from people aren't as flexible as they need to be. And that is one way, one policy that does that. The other recommendations that flowed from the consortium has to do with temporary prohibitions for people convicted of misdemeanor crimes of violence. There's studies showing significant reductions in violent crime, 29% in one study, and a reduction in intimate partner homicide of 25% as well. Another important risk factor that some states address, but most do not, is repeated problems with alcohol abuse and alcohol-related crimes. Incredibly high risk for serious acts of violence in that subgroup. Sadly, we don't have a lot of data on the effects of available policies, but I think that's a priority in the years to come. Also stressed by this group, and this is sort of in part where the extreme risk protection order emerged from, is looking at current policies with firearm prohibitions for domestic violence restraining orders, that when you expand those to temporary orders and to dating partners, you have significant reductions in partner homicide. Next slide, please. All right, very briefly, I want to describe the most effective ways to keep guns from individuals who are prohibited. And that is through a system of comprehensive background checks, ideally that is part of a licensing or permitting system. I'll just show you a few slides just to so this is simply, there are different ways to get guns. You can go through law enforcement, which is the permitting system. You can go to some gun dealers who are sometimes shady, and there are other options as well. Next slide. Here's what we found when Missouri repealed its permitting or licensing law for handguns in 2007. Next slide. This is the difference between Missouri's homicide rates versus that of all the other United States, the other 49 states. See a dramatic jump in 2008, precisely after the law was repealed. Next slide. You also saw a steady rise in firearm-related suicides as well. Next slide. When you put all together in a variety of forms of analysis to control for everything you need to control for, you get about a 20% increase in firearm homicide connected to this and a 16% increase in suicide. Next slide. When Missouri adopted the same kind of policy that Missouri repealed, we found a mirror opposite kind of effects, this time in the protective direction. 40% lower rate of firearm homicides over the first 10 years and 29% over 18 years. And again, a significant reduction in suicide. Next slide. We can come to assault weapons later. I'm just going to show you one data nugget, if you will, as it relates to concealed carry. We've had dramatic changes in concealed carry laws over the past 30 years. This is just a look at the map of how this changes with the orange and yellow signaling very restrictive issuing of permits to carry a concealed weapon in 1990. Next slide. And now here we are in where we are right now, in the vast majority of our map, there's little or no restrictions that relates to concealed carry. What has been the effect of that? Because many say the solution to our problems with bad guys with guns is more good guys and gals with guns out there. What have we learned from that social experiment? Next slide will be a simple kind of explanation of this. This is from research from John Donahue's group at Stanford. And what you see here on the bottom is, which each year a state has a shall issue or right to carry law in place, their violent crime grows with each year and more permits and more people, more good and good gals with guns out there. We do not see a lowering of violent crime. We see it growing greater and greater. I'll end my discussion there, and we can come back to assault weapons perhaps in this discussion if we got time.